Welcome to the Hunt at Halas, another one of our off-season series that we're doing for the YouTube channel. We're going to be posting this in podcast format as well, so you can listen to it on the go. It'll be available on Apple Pod, Spotify, Amazon, Stitcher, Deezer, wherever you may get your podcast from. But the last, I want to say 72 to 96 hours have been really intriguing for the Bears because Monday morning the news breaks that Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy aren't coming back. And, for this episode, we're going to focus more on the head coaches. And there's a lot of interesting names because Brian Daboll, certainly interesting. Brian Flores, certainly interesting. I just realized that two of these guys' names are Brian, by the way.
Yeah.
Very, very intriguing, right? And then you have Doug Pederson. Now, a lot of people would, I think, getting into Doug Pederson here, look at him and say, hey, well, he's just a kind of better version of Matt Nagy, which again, I see where people are coming from. But then again, also at the end of the day, I think there's something you have to consider with Doug Pederson is that he literally did modify his entire offense to fit Nick Foles when Carson Wentz went down. And what was the major gripe that Bears fans had with Matt Nagy? It was that Matt Nagy's inability to adjust and build his offense, scheme the offense to whatever the players' strengths were, was a consistent issue and the reason that the Bears were really bad on offense over the last basically 3 seasons. And so I would be open to see mixed on Doug Peterson because I don't want a second time head coach that kind of quote unquote failed. But then there's also this other half of the argument that you could argue this too, that Doug Peterson was dealt a really bad hand in Philadelphia where the owner and the general manager basically pushed him out as a result of a power struggle and pushed out his offensive staff too. But other than that, when we look at Peterson's success in 5 to 6 seasons with Philly compared to what the Bears did with Matt Nagy in 4 years, you could definitely say that Peterson, some of his team and roster was so average, but he still got more out of them than the average head coach would.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people that just associates Doug Pederson with Matt Nagy. The both are two very close. Obviously, came from the Andy Reid coaching tree. They coached together at Kansas City, and Doug Pederson has a long history in the NFL as a quarterback, as an offensive coordinator, into his time at head coach with the Philadelphia Eagles. You're completely right that you can't take a Super Bowl championship away, right? Specifically from a team that was able to do it against Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. Specifically a team that was able to do it without their starting quarterback, who was having an MVP-like season, fantastic organization that year. They were the underdogs. They were really building in that identity, that culture, and Doug Pederson was a huge part of that. And of course, we can't forget the Philly special, which was actually a interesting play for where the origins of the Philly special came from, but we won't dive into that. But no, Doug Pederson, right? I'm not a fan of the move for Doug Pederson. Absolutely no disrespect to Doug Pederson as a coach. He has an over 500 win record. He's 4-2 in the playoffs, right? Obviously, he has a Super Bowl win, like I just said. You can't take that away from him. But the last thing we need to move from mediocrity is back to mediocrity, right? So outside of that one Super Bowl win, Philadelphia Eagles never really were able to fly outside of that one instance. And they had relatively two incredibly talented rosters, or at least positions on the roster. The Carson Wentz scenario, unfortunately, he got injured, couldn't deal with any of the he continuously was injured, couldn't deal with rehab as well as maybe analysts and fans wanted him to. So they were stuck with the quarterback situation. They had talent at the wide receiver position that ultimately deteriorated. There are a lot of issues with the Eagles, as Eagles fans will tell you. One of the most passionate fan bases that I've ever interacted with in my life was meeting Philadelphia Eagles fans for the first time. They do not like Doug Pederson. Or I'll take that back. 75% don't like Doug Pederson, at least in my personal anecdote. You may know something different if you're watching, but majority of the Eagles fans that I know do not like Doug Pederson. And of course, that doesn't mean everything at the end of the day for an indictment of a coach, but if fans genuinely don't like your coach, it's probably a good reason why. I look at the schemes, I look at the player personnel, I look at the packages, and there might be some familiarity for Justin Fields going to a second year. What was unfortunate with Mitch Trubisky was throwing him into a completely new offensive scheme his second year in the NFL, right? So it might be difficult for Justin Fields to adapt to that. after spending incredibly important developmental time under Matt Nagy, learning that scheme for his first year as professional. It might be difficult for him to pivot into something completely new, and Doug Pederson might bring some of that familiarity. And I guarantee you that's the pitch that he made was, hey, Matt and I are personal friends. Remember, I came to Halas Hall over the offseason and assisted with some training programs. I assisted Justin Fields, all that jazz. I'm sure he's going to make that pitch. Sorry, he already did make that pitch. But at the end of the day, I just don't think it's anything new enough. I don't think it's going to lead to success on the field, right? And that's what George McCaskey said. The one thing that he wants, right, is an indicator of success. It's success on the field. And at the end of the day, I don't think Doug Pederson's going to bring that.
Yeah, you certainly have to question his entire approach because, look, and again, when we do this for general manager candidates, hopefully we get a chance to do that. What we'll talk about is you don't want to kind of keep going back to the same ideas because it's like the Bears need more than anything right now a complete breath of fresh air. And so if you go back to Doug Pederson, you're basically going to be saying, yeah, you know what? We haven't learned our lesson. And again, I've been very critical of George McCaskey. I said this in the show on Monday, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say this again. George McCaskey is not fit to be chairman of this team. And there's two instances in that press conference that showed me that. When you look at him, he's been the chairman for basically a decade now. And in that decade, he's been through 3 general managers and 4 head coaches. That's not a very successful track record. But then also the second thing that kind of stuck out to me was when Matt Nagy asked him during the 2020 season what his thoughts would be on starting Justin Fields. And George basically replied, yeah, I do not have an answer. I feel uncomfortable answering that question. Now, I'm not saying that as the owner of a multi-billion-dollar business, you need to have an understanding of everything that goes on. But at the end of the day, you better have an idea of what your franchise quarterback is, what he's good at, what he's not good at, as well as when to start him and when not to start him. Like, those are things that George McCaskey needs to know because, again, this is the guy that basically this is the chairman that gave Ryan Pace full autonomy to go out and to cut Jay Cutler, draft Mitch Trubisky, pay Mike Glennon $18.5 million a year. And then those moves didn't work out. Then you went out and traded for Nick Foles and guaranteed him $21 million a year. That didn't work out. So you went out and you paid Andy Dalton another $10 million a year. And meanwhile, outside of Andy Dalton, we're not even getting into trading another first round pick for Justin Fields. And so you're the GM who basically you're the chairman who let your GM sign off on all this stuff. And yet, if you go and you hire Doug Pederson, you know what? It's going to be one of those instances where, George, you haven't learned, and this team is just better off without you.
No, you're completely right. We've been saying this throughout the entire season that things are making us go crazy because they keep happening over and over and over and over again, right? And a good organization notices a bad trend and does something to stop it. If this organization brings in Doug Pederson, which again, no, I'm sure Doug Pederson will more than likely have a head coaching job at the end of this summer. He should have a coaching job, if not a head coaching job. He took a year off, kind of recouped his image, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, you're completely right. We won't have learned any lessons if we bring in a guy who will run a team, run an offense, just like Matt Nagy. I'm surprised. Really, I'm going to take that. I'm not surprised. I think the reason why Doug Pederson got an interview at all is out of respect for Matt, right? Because the organization quite clearly still has some sort of respect for Matt Nagy, which we as fans should. Like, Matt Nagy it seems like a class guy. He's handled it all incredibly well. I have nothing, it's not like he's a terrible human being. Seems like he's a really genuinely good guy. So there's nothing wrong there. I'm sure that's why Doug got an interview, or at least a nod, out of respect for him, his portfolio, and also out of respect for Matt Nagy, right? His actions, his ring speaks for itself. But when we're comparing him to other names, right? And if there were names like Brian Daboll weren't there, Brian Flores weren't there, right? If names like Jim Harbaugh weren't on the board, I'm sure Doug Pederson would look like a really great candidate. But unfortunately for him in this market, there are much better, much more, I guess, energetic, much more creative guys who are on the scene now that could really lead us to this next generation of football and put the Bears, instead of playing catch up with old tools and old toys, putting us ahead of the curve with guys who are leading edge and guys who are pushing the direction of the National Football League, right? That's exactly what the Bears need, because we have the roster. Ryan Pace built us a roster to be at the leading edge of this football league. We just need guys to come in and really solidify that, and a head coach to really organize that.
Yeah, we do. And, speaking of being an organized head coach, I would definitely say that another name to kind of look at as someone that is pretty organized, despite all the media rumors that are floating around out there, would be Brian Flores. And I just got off another podcast, but I'm going to bring the same stuff back. Is that I think when people look at Brian Flores, everyone has their skepticisms of him just because he is an expatriates coordinator and position coach. And so ultimately, when you look at that, you think, okay, well, complete recipe for disaster brewing. I mean, look at the New York Giants on, I believe it was Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon. They went ahead and fired Joe Judge. And it's not like there's a certain someone that was on here talking to our friends over at Fireside Giants saying that Joe Judge wasn't a good head coach from the time he was hired. But anyways, they're enjoying the Bears' first round pick, which again, it doesn't matter if, they messed that up some way, somehow. So it's all looks good on paper, doesn't it, Max? But then can absolutely look terrible when the results begin to show. But the point is, I think Brian Flores is an intriguing name because he does coach his players hard. He coaches with discipline. There's not really many issues with execution. I think on paper, when you look at Miami's records over the last couple seasons, we have to understand one big thing. We need to understand that Miami's dealt with a ton of injuries, right? And specifically the injuries to quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. When you look at those, you realize that Flores handled those about as well as any head coach could have. Okay. In 2019, he was thrust into a situation where it's like he didn't want Josh Rosen, but then the owner, Stephen Ross, was very adamant on figuring out what the solution for the franchise was going to be. And lo and behold, Miami coughed up some picks for Rosen. But ultimately, Flores' track record speaks to itself right now. And despite the fact that he's missed the playoffs, you know what? He, I think, can come in and in a city like Chicago, turn the franchise around quicker because let's be honest about something. Where the Bears are at going into 2022 for a first year head coach with the franchise compared to where the Dolphins were at in 2019, the Bears have the upper hand in almost every aspect right now.
Yeah, 100%. I was thinking about this earlier because there's three things with Brian Flores that really interest me, and we have to understand when we're looking at him as a potential head coaching candidate. And that's one, he never wanted Tua, according to rumors, but it makes sense, right? If everybody who watches the fan, anyone who's a fan of the Dolphins, makes sense. Brian Flores wasn't advocating for Tua. The rumor is Brian Flores was advocating for Justin Herbert and would have much rather had Justin Herbert on his team than Tua. That didn't happen, but what did Brian do? He didn't cry about it. He tried to put Tua in situations to win and to succeed, right? You're completely right. Brian Flores is from the Bill Belichick tree, but so is Brian Daboll, right? Brian Daboll actually is in the Saban Belichick tree. And you know who else is in the Saban Belichick tree? Joe Judge, like you just mentioned. So if we really care about that so much, then maybe we should be looking negatively at Brian Daboll, but we'll get onto that. Two, with Brian Flores, is he's incredibly streaky, right? Look at the Dolphins the past 2 years. They start off terribly, right? Because they're looking at issues with injuries, and two, the roster just really isn't that talented at the end of the day. But they somehow find ways to win, which is an indicative of a great coach and a great coaching staff. Is the Dolphins barely missed the playoffs this year, right? Barely. They shouldn't even have been in that conversation if we're looking at week 7. And then they just go on this immaculate win streak, and all of a sudden, holy cow, the Dolphins are one game out of the playoffs if they beat the Tennessee Titans. Hard to beat the Tennessee Titans right now. Hard to beat them the past couple of years, let alone in this right now when they're the number 1 seed in the AFC. So there's zero reason we should be pointing at the record of the Miami Dolphins over the past couple of years and going, well, this because Brian Flores is a bad coach. No, I completely disagree with that. And 3, he was in a terrible front office. Like, you just cannot deny the fact that Miami Dolphins owner Stephen Ross, Mr. Ross, is incredibly no-show. He's just a no-show kind of guy. He seems like he doesn't really care about his organization as much as he should, from a fan's perspective. It's insane. And there is a credible power struggle within the Dolphins front office. Brian Flores obviously wanted to make directions, the general manager and the rest of the staff obviously wanted to make other decisions. And it seemed like it was just a bad situation all around. And Brian Flores was cut, right? It's always odd when you see coaches who find success with what they were given being told to go away at the end of the season because they weren't saying yes consistently to the front office, right? We heard a lot of rumors out of Miami over a while about, they want a new quarterback or they want this or they want that. I'm fairly confident now looking back at that was Brian Flores and the coaching staff disagreeing with the general management, right? So Deshaun Watson, according to rumors, was completely Brian Flores. That there were some analysts who were saying that was Brian Flores' opinion. He wanted Deshaun Watson back in the offseason when the Texans said that they were interested in trading him. So he was leading that push. And then I'm actually going to add on a caveat. I'm going to add on a fourth piece here, if you're still with me, is Brian Flores likes Justin Fields. We know this because the Dolphins and the Bears had joint training camp over the offseason. And Brian Flores had nothing but great things to say about Justin Fields and his work ethic, right? And George McCaskey said in the press conference, that in the interviews, one of the most important aspects is going to be how our coach is going to use Justin Fields, right? He didn't commit, or he didn't make any grandiose statement about how much he loves Justin Fields, but he did tell reporters that they're going to see how our coach is planning on using Justin in a quarterback position in the near future. So I feel like Brian Flores has a pretty good, track record there, at least with positive statements towards Justin Fields. So I think he's probably right now second best candidate on the board, and probably might just be front runner out flat for Halas Hall.
Yeah, and you have to wonder. I mean, maybe Flores talks to the Bears brass on Friday, January 14th, and then ultimately decides, you know what, this is totally the right destination for me. And then the Bears feel the same way too, and then just hire him right there and call it a day. So I think there is a chance that we could go into the weekend, possibly early next week, and then the Bears have their head coach in place. Regarding the general manager, I think that you have to keep something in mind, is that, George McCaskey basically said, hey, if the opportunity to hire the right head coach comes along, but there's competition for that head coach, we will just hire that head coach outright rather than worrying about the general manager. But outside of Flores and Pederson, I mean, the third name to keep an eye on here is Brian Daboll, offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills. And yeah, Buffalo's had its fair share of struggles over the last couple seasons on offense, but one thing people have to understand regarding Brian Daboll is that Brian Daboll has been with the Bills since the day they drafted Josh Allen. Brian Daboll is one of the main guys that's responsible for overseeing the development of Josh Allen. And I remember very fondly covering that 2018 draft because it was about 4 to 5 years ago. There were people at the time who were putting third, fourth, fifth round grades on Josh Allen. There were people who were looking at him and saying, yeah, he's got a big arm, but he's inaccurate. He's just not a football savvy kid. He's going to be someone that, as a result of playing in a smaller school and relative inexperience, he's going to flame out in the NFL. Josh Allen's been the exact opposite of that. And so the Bears need to look at Brian Daboll and look at Brian Daboll hard, because the scheme that Brian Daboll runs in Buffalo is going to be the exact same scheme that Justin Fields would continue to just thrive in.
Yeah. Brian Daboll is an interesting guy. Bill, he has connections with Bill Polian, as reported. Bill Polian, actually, his son went to high school with Brian Daboll and helped get Brian Daboll one of his first jobs as graduate assistant at Michigan State under Nick Saban. So there's connections there to Bill Polian, which might be one of the reasons why we were able to get him request an interview this early. He's also looking at the New York Giants right now, and that seems like a really good fit as well. Brian Daboll's offense is built around elusive, speedy backs and a quarterback with a cannon of an arm and incredible deep threats wide receivers. That is essentially the Brian Daboll offense in a nutshell. You also need solid tight ends to be able to pick out the flats and sit in the underneath while your deep threat wide receivers stretch the field and you have a quarterback that's able to make those deep ball throws. So I completely it makes perfect sense to me as to why Chicago makes a lot of sense for Brian Daboll. It makes a lot of sense why New York would make a lot of sense with Brian Daboll, with Danny Jones. And Justin Fields has that deep arm, right? We know Justin Fields has a big arm, and we know statistically he has one of the most accurate deep balls in the league. The only holes that I could see for Brian Daboll walking into this season or with the Chicago Bears is at that deep ball threat position in the wide receiver room. Outside of Darnell Mooney, who hasn't really shown he's able to be that deep ball guy, we don't have one. So that might be a glaring issue for him on the roster. But from the running back room to the quarterback room, even at tight ends, Cole Kmet could see a huge bump in production with Brian Daboll at the helm. But yeah, you're completely right. The offenses are incredibly similar.
Yeah, and when you talk about tight ends, because I'm glad you brought the tight ends up in Brian Daboll's system. I mean, when you watch the Bills, there's two primary options in that passing offense. You have Stephon Diggs is number one, but then number two, you have Dawson Knox at tight end. And you could actually argue this more, is that Dawson Knox has legitimately become Josh Allen's best friend. Okay, how many times did we see this year Dawson Knox is kind of the one that showed up in crunch time for the Buffalo offense, because that chemistry with Josh Allen certainly mattered. And so I want to bring that up because I feel like when you look at the Bears down the stretch in the offense before Justin Fields got hurt, he was also clicking with Darnell Mooney considerably well, along with Cole Kmet. And Cole Kmet, more than anyone, I think kind of stuck out to me because he really showed, guess what, no matter what, at the end of the day, I can be here and I can play an integral role in an offense.
Yeah, we saw Justin Fields at least attempt a lot more throws to Cole Kmet in the second half of the season than we did in the first half of the season. Again, Cole Kmet, for some reason, gets a lot more attempts in the second half of the season under the Nagy offense. If you look at 2019, 2020, the stats are incredibly similar there. 2020 to 2021. I completely forgot there. So no, you're right. Justin Fields next year is most likely going to be looking at Cole Kmet as kind of that safety valve option. There's a lot of questions at the wide receiver room and offensive personnel going into this offseason with how many one-year contracts we had signed. The cap situation is good on paper, or at least on a graphic. But when you really look in the papers, you realize that the cap situation isn't nearly as good as it could have been. So that might be a reason why Ryan Pace is gone right now. But no, Brian Daboll, what he brings is an exciting offense. He's not the most exhilarating electric guy in front of media, but hell, Brian Flores doesn't even speak to media half the time in an open census. So there's a lot of hype around Brian Daboll just because of what the Bills have done over the past couple of years, right? Going from a team that we literally embarrassed on television in 2018 to now being front runners for the Super Bowl 2 years in a row. Josh Allen has had a bit of an off year this year, which I think has kind of lowered Brian Daboll's stock just a bit. We look at the interception numbers and it's kind of stark compared to last year. Josh Allen's kind of been relying on his legs again this year, which we didn't see as much last year. We saw him starting to rely on his arm. But that doesn't, I don't really know if that's indicative entirely on Brian Daboll. Also, a big concern that a lot of Bears fans have is a claim that he doesn't run the ball a lot. It's completely false. The Bills are in the top 10 for rushing attempts, especially in the second half of this season. When it gets cold, they start pounding the ball, which Daboll knows incredibly well. So him coming over to Chicago shouldn't be that much of a difference. There's a lot to like, but again, I'm going to say this on behalf of our friends at Fireside Bears. Fireside Giants. I personally think Brian Daboll makes more sense in New York. I would love to have him here in Chicago. Don't get me wrong, but I think he makes more sense in New York with what New York has right now from a scheme perspective. Brian Daboll makes more sense there. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, but I think what is the Bears are at a point where it's seemingly trending. And again, I don't really trust George McCaskey that much. I trust Bill Polian, not George McCaskey. But it's seemingly trending in a direction where the Bears can't possibly screw this up, can they? Because on paper, the list of candidates looks good. But then again, we are talking about the Chicago Bears here, who do everything backwards, including activating Justin Fields from the reserve/COVID-19 list when there's no general manager who's supposed to be making that decision. There's no head coach who has any input in that decision. And the chairman of your franchise, who's the son of the owner, doesn't even have a damn idea as to what to do regarding Justin Fields. So it's going to be an exciting next few weeks, guys, throughout the month of January. Hopefully the Bears have these positions filled soon. We are going to get out of this thing. So make sure you're following us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at FireSideBears. Follow myself on Twitter at Usayd Kosho, and follow my co-host Maxx on Twitter at MaxSmithESM. Gonna be really fun to see what the Bears do, because we are entering, I should say, what's shaping up to be the most intriguing offseason in Bears history. But other than that, ladies and gentlemen, bear down, stay safe. We'll see you guys next time.